Okay, so we're building these incredibly powerful AI systems, right? But with all that power comes a really critical question. How do we make sure they're being managed responsibly? I mean, it's not enough for an AI to just be smart. It has to be trustworthy. And that trust? It's built on having clear, consistent standards. And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? As AI gets woven into pretty much everything we do, from our healthcare to our finances, how do we actually maintain control? And maybe even more importantly, how do we actually trust what's happening behind the curtain with these incredibly complex systems? Well, in the world of information security, the answer to that big question, it comes down to a framework called GRC. It stands for Governance, Risk, and Compliance, and it's pretty much the essential playbook for managing complex systems, especially AI, in a way that's both responsible and ethical.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with a quick look at the GRC framework itself. Then we'll dive into each piece one by one. First governance, then risk management, and finally compliance. And we'll wrap things up by looking at the bigger picture, accountability, and what's next for the rules of AI.
Okay, let's kick things off with governance, the G in GRC. This is all about one thing: establishing control over your systems and getting crystal clear visibility into what's actually happening inside them. You can think of it as setting the rules of the road for your whole operation. You know, AI is nothing without data, right? And that's what makes data governance so incredibly important. We're not just talking about where you store the data. We're talking about the quality of your training sets, making sure bias doesn't creep in, and having clearly defined roles for who is responsible for how that data shapes what the AI actually does. So that's the what. But how do you actually do it? Well, a tool like AWS Config is a perfect real-world example. First, it's constantly tracking the configuration of all your resources. Now, if something changes and it's not supposed to, it falls out of line with your policies, it detects that misconfiguration immediately. And here's the kicker. It provides a detailed audit trail, which is absolutely essential when you need to prove you're following the rules. So if you're going to remember one thing about governance, let it be this simple equation. Governance isn't just one or the other. It's the combination of having both control and visibility. You really need both to make it work. All right, so you've got your governance in place. You've got control, you've got visibility. What's next? Well, that brings us to risk management, the R in GRC. This is where you go on the offensive, proactively hunting for threats to your systems. So what do we mean by risk management? Well, it's basically the formal process of looking for the weak spots in your setup. You identify potential vulnerabilities, you figure out how serious they are, and then, this is the important part, you prioritize them. That way, you can tackle the biggest, scariest threats first. And a perfect example of a tool that helps you do this is Amazon Inspector. Think of it as your own personal vulnerability manager. It automatically scans your environment, it finds things like network exposures, and, this part's crucial, it gives every finding a risk score. That tells you exactly what to pay attention to right now. And, of course, it logs everything for your audit trail. So the big idea here with risk management is all about being proactive. You're not just sitting around waiting for a fire alarm. You're actively looking for the frayed wires and fixing them before they can ever start a fire. It's all about reducing risk before an incident happens. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the C, compliance. This is where we talk about following the specific rules, regulations, and standards that are set by different industries and governments. This is all about making sure you're playing by the established rules of the game. And man, there are a lot of different rulebooks out there. Let's just take a quick look. You've got industry-specific ones like PCI-DSS if you handle credit cards, or HIPAA for healthcare data in the US. Some are regional, like the famous GDPR, which protects the privacy of EU citizens. Then you have broader security standards like NIST, which is huge in the US government, and ISO 27001, which is a big international benchmark. And finally, you have SOC reports, which are all about proving an organization's internal controls to build trust. Now, let's zoom in on those SOC reports for a second, because there's a really important distinction you need to know. A SOC 1 report, that's all about financial reporting controls. But a SOC 2 report, that's the one we often care about more in tech. It's focused on what they call trust services, things like security, availability, confidentiality, and privacy. And just to make it a little more interesting, there's another layer here, Type 1 versus Type 2. Think of a Type 1 report as a single photo, a snapshot of your controls on one specific day. But a Type 2 report, that's like a video. It shows that those controls were working effectively over a whole period of time, say 6 months. Obviously, for building real trust, that Type 2 is the gold standard. So where do you get the proof that you're compliant? Well, a service like AWS Artifact is basically your go-to hub for all these documents. It gives you direct access to AWS's own compliance reports for ISO, PCI, and SOC. But, and this is super important to understand, it's a shared responsibility model. AWS takes care of the compliance of the cloud, but you are always responsible for your compliance in the cloud. You use their reports as the foundation to build your own case. Okay, so we've covered the G, the R, and the C. That's the what and the how. But now let's zoom out a bit and talk about the why. What are the core principles driving all these rules? And seriously, where is all this heading in the age of AI?
You're going to hear two words thrown around all the time in this space: accountability and transparency. They sound similar, but they're not the same thing. Accountability is all about answering the question, who did what? It relies on things like detailed logs, defined roles, and legal responsibility. Transparency, on the other hand, answers a totally different question. What are you doing with my data? This is all about being upfront and honest with users through clear terms of service and data policies.
And here's the thing, with AI, this isn't a settled field. It's the Wild West. The rules are literally being written as we speak. You've got massive efforts like the EU AI Act, which is basically the first ever comprehensive legal framework for all of AI. And then you see things at the local level, like in New York City, which passed a law that specifically targets bias in automated hiring systems. The landscape is changing fast.
Okay, let's do a super quick recap. This is the stuff you'll want to remember. Governance and tracking? AWS Config. Proactive risk management? That's Amazon Inspector. Need those compliance reports? AWS Artifact is your hub. And for the big frameworks, HIPAA means US healthcare, GDPR is all about EU privacy, and ISO 27001 is that big global standard for security management. And all of this leaves us with one final, pretty big question. We're busy building these frameworks like GRC based on the technology and the challenges we understand today. But as AI keeps evolving at this incredible breakneck speed, are the rules we're scrambling to write now going to be anywhere near enough for the challenges AI will throw at us tomorrow?